A few weeks ago we met and you told me about how the old revolution started. I think, what date was it, Nathaniel? You know the date?
March 2011.
Right. So can you explain to us like a bit what actually happened? I mean, what your information about those events is?
Well, I have to use a microphone.
If you want, yeah, I think it works.
Yeah. Hello everyone, good afternoon. Concerning this the so-called Syrian revolution, there are too many stories told by the media, but some of them are true, some of them are based on events that took place. But there is as well a side of the story that is not being told to the public, even in Syria, because mainstream media anyway, even the Arabic mainstream media, is funded by funded by those who are driving this insanity in my country. Basically, it's the story. I stood against the Syrian government in the beginning of the crisis, and I wrote like some kind of a little article in a blog among different Syrians. We used to go to that blog and discuss issues concerning the Syrian crisis. And it was, I said it was very legitimate movement from the people of Daraa, the city where the crisis started, to protest against the authoritarian regime. We can call it a dictatorship as well. But there is another side of the story that nobody knows, and obviously nobody is talking about it in the media, mainstream media. Actually, my family lives in Syria, and my brother lives, and now he's in Russia, but he was in Syria during that time. And we have friends all over Syria, from north to south, and especially in the city of Daraa. They were students studying at the University of Damascus. Close friends, I would say. And we were in touch with them over social media and Skype and other means of communication. And we were told by them what happened, actually, what really happened. So basically, it started with, which is a bit of a myth in the media. It started with few kids writing against Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, writing on walls, graffiti on walls in the city of Daraa against Bashar al-Assad. Then they were captured by the Syrian intelligence, tortured, and so on and so forth. Their families went to the security headquarters of Daraa, asked for the release of their children. They were humiliated, and then they were told, humiliated very badly, and they were told you have to forget about your kids, and so on and so forth. That's the mainstream media side of the story. And then a protest movement started in the city of Daraa, claiming the return of the kids, and the kids were returned to their parents, like in a hideous condition, beaten up, bleeding everywhere, and so on. Now, when I spoke to the people of Daraa, the people at least that I know, they did not know the names of the children or the names of the families. They did not know how many children they were. And it was like, all right, that's not significant. Something happened that initiated this protest, this demonstration in Daraa. So what happened? He said, all right, a demonstration took place. Someone was shot dead, of course, by a sniper. And of course, everybody ran away. Everybody tried to hide and so on. And then some kind of communication started between the Syrian government and different leaders in the city of Daraa, tried to calm down the situation. And Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, gives direct orders that no one is allowed to shoot any protester or demonstrators on the streets. And actually asked the security forces to protect demonstrations and just preserve the law. And they agreed on letting a funeral to go through the streets of Daraa, and they allowed any kind of protest and demonstration during that funeral. So what happened again? During that funeral, other people were shot dead on the head. They were sniped, they were killed, and the whole thing got worse and worse, and the security forces were forced to go into the city and deal with a serious uprising, serious instability. One of the main things, like this little story is in a duration of 3-4 days. Now, on the 4th day, when things got really, really bad, the governor headquarters in Daraa was attacked by RPGs. It's some kind of rockets. And of course, some people armed with Kalashnikovs attacked the headquarters of the government in Daraa, and they attacked the security headquarters in Daraa. So there was shooting from both sides. And again, I was in touch with these people in Daraa, and I was told that don't worry, we have weapons, we have enough weapons to protect ourselves up to SAM missiles, like SAM missiles, surface air missiles, which is air defense missiles. And I was really shocked. At that point, I was a bit confused. What's going on? You cannot access SAM missiles in the black market. That's an impossible thing. I know you can access RPGs, you can access Kalashnikovs, especially from Iraq, but you cannot access SAM missiles. This is a serious issue. This is a matter of national security, not just for the Syrian government, it's for the American government, for the Iraqi government. No unorganized armed group can access SAM missiles unless it was supported directly by major powers, like the case of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the...
Right. So, I mean, I think the fact that this rebellion is supported by, as I said, like from foreign powers, it's actually out there, so it's not even a mystery anymore. But what do you think that actually implies? I mean, how can you call this a legitimate rebellion against the government? Is if foreign powers, right, are supporting with like guns we cannot find in the black market?
Yeah.
I mean, how can...
Let me just explain. It's the crisis in Syria. I just wanted to start with this. The crisis in Syria has two aspects. There is a humanitarian aspect and a geopolitical aspect. To understand both of them, you have to understand the geography of Syria, in particular the city of Daraa. The city of Daraa is basically on the border of Jordan. Jordan is an ally, a very strong ally of the US, or let's say any NATO country, and Israel. Israel is the only geopolitical foe to Syria, and the regional geopolitical foe to Syria. We have a serious problem with Israel, and we know for sure that Israel can access Syria through the city of Daraa because it's on the border with Syria. As we do as well, but because we make trouble to the Israelis through Lebanon, for example, through the south of Lebanon, through the Syrian government allies, Hezbollah. At least it's recognized here as a terrorist organization. Some people think it's a legitimate resistance movement in the south of Lebanon. It's a long story. We have to discuss the history of the issue, but what I'm saying, the Israelis always try to cause trouble to the Syrian government through the border cities. One of them is Daraa. Now, the presence of military experts, ex-Marines, ex-CIA agents, and and from different countries, not just the US and Britain, even the Jordanians were involved in this. The presence of these experts in the personnel on the border with Syria and Jordan is, like, you can find. I mean, I cannot prove to you, but you can look it up. It's there. There is evidence. Too many serious newspapers and journalists wrote about it. For example, Simon Hirsch of the New Yorker, on different occasions, wrote about the work between the American government and the Islamic radical jihadists, for example, in Lebanon and Jordan against Syria, and the Lebanese sectarian government, which was allied with Syria, and their famous Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. So they wanted to create a serious fighting group in the region, which can face a militia like Hezbollah, to at least get started with proper negotiations, but they couldn't do it. The militia, the Sunni jihadi militia, was crushed in Lebanon by Hezbollah militia. But as well, there is another militias that were trained by the military experts from the West in Jordan, and they were all jihadists. You might find that strange. How come foreign governments train and fund extremist jihadists from the Muslim world?
Right.
And you think, this is just unrational. I would say it is unrational, and the U.S. government has done all over the time a rational coalition. I mean, for example, supporting the Mujahideen to make trouble for the Russians in Afghanistan, and again in Syria and in Lebanon, through Jordan and through the north of Lebanon. Now, to say how come the Syrian government and the Bashar al-Assad himself gives his word to the people of Daraa that you can go and demonstrate on the streets, I will guarantee you safety, and he is an authoritarian man, he is a strong man, he holds the country tight. How come he allows such events to take place and allows his security forces to shoot people on the head, especially like I think it was to provoke these people, to make them angry more, and to go again on the streets and cause more trouble. It didn't make any sense. I'm just trying to bring logic to this session. It doesn't make any sense that the Syrian government inflamed the situation in Daraa, although it's very famous and well known of its brutality. But because of what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, it wouldn't make any sense for the Syrian government to follow even more harsher measures against the rebellion in Daraa.
So what you're saying there is that this spontaneous rebellions, demonstrations were like infiltrated. I mean, that's like that's what the government side of the story is, that this demonstrations were infiltrated by armed groups. And,
the fact of the matter is, there were armed people among the demonstrators, because on the fourth day I told you there was serious attacks on the headquarters of the government and the security forces. That's one, too. Through my communication with people who are in the opposition, they are against the Syrian government, they don't like Bashar al-Assad, they don't like the Syrian government, and they are still in the opposition side, they're still demonstrating and fighting against Bashar al-Assad. Through my communication with them, I was told that there were, and actually it was all over their social media, that there were people who are armed, and they had, because Syria, again, it's hard to understand Syria because it's very diverse in terms of ethnicities and religions and sects of different religions. The nature of these fighters who were armed was from a certain sect, Muslim Sunni, and they, through their social media pages, they were open about their sectarianism and how they're going to slaughter all the Christians or the Alawites or the Druze, which are all
See,
sects.
about this, I think a lot of people here, I mean, obviously we're going a lot into details, but the common idea we have over here is that this is actually a rebellion supported by the majority of the Syrian people. That's, I mean, when we, for example, even the US spoke about the Al-Qaeda infiltration, you know, of all the revolution. But still people think, oh yeah, but that's just a little part. The other parts are like secular democratic fighters fighting for democratic reasons. I mean, obviously you're saying that there isn't any of that. That's my opinion as well. But how would you actually prove that? I mean, to someone that.
Well, basically, let me say this: the Syrian government. I'm not going to go back through history and how this kind of, let's call it regime, came to power 40 years ago. The Syrian government is very secular. It's one of the only secular governments in the Middle East. Everywhere you go in the Middle East, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Iran, Iraq now, Turkey, everywhere you go in the Middle East, of course Saudi Arabia, like the GCC, all of these countries, Gulf states. Everywhere you go in the Middle East, everybody has an ID card, even in Syria, which is a very common in the Middle East. Now, every country mentions the religion and sect of every individual on the card, which is, I think, it's a bit strange. There is no existence of the notion secularism or atheism or being just refusal to be labeled under any religion in all the countries in the Middle East, except for Syria. In Syria, there is no discrimination against any religion or sect in the country because the government is extremely secular and it maintains its power and the stability of the country through its secularism. I just wanted to say that the Syrian government, in the middle of the crisis, the top officials in charge of the crisis, in charge of handling the crisis, were assassinated in their meeting room in the middle of Damascus. It was a serious, obviously, very advanced operation, definitely, without any questioning. It was managed and operated by very serious professionals. And I can tell it's the Israelis, the Americans, but it doesn't matter, we cannot prove it. But those who were killed were the defense minister, the head of security, and a military expert who is very famous in Syria. I'm going to go through the names and the religions of these people. The defense minister, Dawood Rajha, he is Christian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. The head of security is, I forgot his name, he's Alawite, Asaf Shawkat, he's Alawite. And the head, and the other guy who was a military expert, he was the head of the chief of staff. He was a Muslim Sunni, and he is from the Turkmen minority. Again, Syria is very diverse, has many ethnicities and religions and sects. And the government, top officials of the government are from all the sects, but they represent extreme secular views. The Syrian government is facing a sectarian movement led by radical Islamists, basically. And it's open. It's like, if you follow especially Arabic media, for example, Al Jazeera Arabic. It's very famous, it's very well known. In a very famous show, religious show on Al Jazeera Arabic, Sheikh Al-Qaradawi, who is a very famous Islamic scholar, he openly said, which is, I think it's a crime. I think he's not allowed to access the EU because of too many views, but one of them was just, I think, a couple of months ago. He openly said live on a very famous program, answering the question, are we allowed to kill civilians and soldiers who are supporting the Syrian government? And he answered by this, we must kill everybody who support the Syrian government, either he's a civilian or a military.
So that would mean like killing these people as well?
Exactly. And I would like to add that the Syrian army is a conscripted army, like every individual in Syria, every young man after he finishes university, he is obliged to go to the army. So the army contains all the aspects of the Syrian society. When they tell you the Syrian army is committing crimes against the Syrian people, against the Muslim population in Syria, you can just say that's absolute lies, because the Syrian army, as I said, contains all the sects of the Syrian society. You cannot just escape the army. You have to serve in the army unless you run away or leave the country and so on. Now, let's measure the support of the two fighting groups, like the Syrian government and the Free Syrian Army, they call it, which is a bunch of militias, radical Islamic militias. They call them, under this umbrella, they call it the Free Syrian Army.
This is obviously Damascus, I think.
Yeah, this is a demonstration in favor of President Bashar al-Assad. Now, they say these people were forced into the streets. I called my parents at that day, and they were at home, having a cup of tea and watching TV. They did not go on the streets, and they lived actually in central Damascus, around the presidential palace. So if they were gonna force anybody, they would force my parents to go out on the street, but nobody forced them and nobody asked them to go on the streets.
What about these people instead? I find it like funny because they're actually doing the Roman salute. Isn't that like the same salute that the National Socialist?
I'm not really familiar with this kind of salute. I think it's just a demonstration where everybody raising his hand.
I mean, this happens even on supporters of Bashar al-Assad. I've seen them do this salute too. So I think it's just something in Syria.
Maybe.
You know what it means?
I'm not. But this is obviously you can see lots of pictures. But again, I'm not here to. I'm just trying to bring logic and rationality to this session. There is no question that the Syrian government is not the kind of democracy you're thinking of. It's not nice. It's brutal when when it deals with a problem. But let's say we have 30% of the people who are religious minorities. Most of them politically do not agree with the Syrian government, but they are in favor of the Syrian government just because they feel safe and protected under the moment.
After the start of this war, people shifted from being anti-Assad, just like you, to being basically pro-Assad because Assad was a guarantor of...
Exactly. So basically Syria, again, the majority of the Syrians are Sunni Muslims. And the majority of the Sunni Muslims are secular Sunni Muslims. They're not radical Islamists. They are well-educated, well-traveled. They form the majority of the middle class. Now, the middle class in Syria is very big. It's not like any other country in the Middle East. They're well-traveled, well-educated, fairly rich, and the majority of them are the Muslim Sunnis. These people, especially the people of Aleppo, and that's why Aleppo is being punished by the rebellion and the armed group.
University got bombed.
Yes, yeah. And not just the university, like planted cars, assassinations. different hideous crimes. We cannot, I mean, the list is almost endless, but Aleppo, the majority of the city of Aleppo are Muslim Sunnis. They're all in favor of the Syrian government, not because they support, again, not because they support Bashar al-Assad politically, but they're just defending their own lives, their own simple lives. We cannot leave, like, for many Syrians who are from different sects, or are from, or secular, or in the Syrian industrialists, the Syrian business elite. How can they support people who bomb gas and oil and gas pipelines, power plants, factories? Why the city of, it's all recorded and all documented, and it was filed to the UN by the Syrian government and other NGOs that more than 600 factories were dismantled in Aleppo, which is the industrial city of Syria, and were sold in Turkey. More than 1 million tons of wheat were stolen from the silos around Aleppo and were sold in Turkey. This is armed robbery against the city of Aleppo. I'm not saying many of Syrians who are in the armed groups, they are poor, they are the uneducated. Fortunately, this is all the responsibility of the Syrian government, but the responsibility of the international community is to help the Syrian government deal with the crisis, not intensify and inflame the situation by sending arms, providing political coverage for international terrorism, sanctioning Syria. For example, my parents get electricity 3 hours a day. Why? Because the US, the EU sanctioned Syria. They do not allow any company to sell power fuel, like we call it diesel. We use actually diesel to run, or gas, natural gas, to run power generators. So we denied access to heating fuel. During the cold winter, they used to sleep in their clothes. Why sanctioning the people of Syria? Why sending arms to people who are openly calling for the slaughter of every minority, of every secular person? They're calling for imposing Sharia law in the country. How come the US does not support, for example, the Palestinian cause and help the Palestinians to at least live normal life under the Israeli occupation? But they don't, but they support instability in Syria. Again, it's a long discussion. I'm open to hear all of your questions, and I'm willing to answer any more questions later on if you're interested in the issue. Because it's a very complex issue. It has, as I said, it has geopolitics. There is a humanitarian aspect of it, and the history of the country. You have to understand the history of the country, how this regime came to power, the nature of the regime, the notion of secular Syria, the problem with Turkey, the problem with Israel, the problem, for example, after the fall of the Iraqi regime, what kind of implication it had on Syria, the sanctions against Syria, against the Syrian people, and the lack of vision among the Syrian opposition and even in the international community. Actually, many people, especially the pro-opposition in Syria, condemn Russia for vetoing a war on their own country. How can you wish to see your country being bombed? I've never liked the Iraqi regime, the Saddam regime. I've never liked the Gaddafi regime. And I've never liked even the Syrian regime. I had no interest in it. But I cannot see my country being bombed and cheer for it. It doesn't make any sense. Not my country, not any country. Not the bombing of Yugoslavia, not the bombing of Iraq, not the bombing of Libya, and what happened in Libya, and how many people died in the bombing of Libya. So you want me to support the bombing of my country to prevent killing people by killing other people. That does not make any sense to me. And of course, again, as I said, the nonsense you see on the mainstream media is what driving people crazy, and they just follow mainstream media as it is given truth. It's not. Most of the things being told and some messages that being sent, for example, okay, let's bomb for humanitarian causes. How is that possible? So you go, destroy the infrastructure of a country, you sanction the country, and then you destroy the infrastructure and kill many other people, innocent people. And then you say, oh, I'm just trying to bomb the country for humanitarian reasons.
I mean, this argument's been going on for, I think, since Yugoslavia. That was, I think, the first humanitarian war. But every time you kind of say that, there are always people saying, oh yeah, but it's, we care about democracy and globalization. We have to export democracy, and we're doing it for good reasons. And they give you like good arguments towards it, and you don't really know how to reply to them, because I mean this could be your view, but then there's a lot of people who are actually convinced of the opposite view, that actually the humanitarian wars in the end, even though there's casualties, in the end, on the long run, there's a positive side. For example,
that's an accepted cost to kill thousands of hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, they call it collateral damage, and I mean.
All right, no, it's not. Let's say I would like to take the case of Iraq, for example, and the case of Libya, where a NATO intervention took place and bombed the country. The case of Iraq was a complete disaster on the Iraqi people, actually on the American government, on the American policy in the Middle East as well. And this is a geopolitical aspect of the issue. But let's focus on the humanitarian aspect. They bombed the country, they completely annihilated the army and its institutions. No infrastructure. Now in Iraq there is no running water, no electricity. Till now, the government is still very sectarian, based on sects, and how the majority of the people, like the majority of the country, are Shia Muslims. So the leader, the real ruler of the country is a Muslim Shia. It's not about merit; it's about sects. Where is Iraq now? It was the home of international terrorism for decades now, after the collapse of the Iraq regime. They go to any country, Libya, the case of Mali, the Libyan connection with Mali. They bombed Libya, they sent jihadists, the same case with the Soviet Union, they did exactly the same to Gaddafi, sanctioned the country, bombed it, sent the jihadists, toppled the government, and that's it. Nobody is talking about how many people died in the bombing. Nobody is talking about how many people were tortured and killed and raped, and how many homes were robbed, and how many people were deported from their homes after the rebels entered certain cities, especially these cities who were not involved in this so-called revolution. And then we get the situation in Mali, but basically Mali is a country, if you have in your mind the African map, it's basically Libya, Algeria, and then just Mali under it. All of these arms flow comes from Libya. Even the same trucks that you used to see on mainstream media carrying, they call them doshkas, it's heavy machine guns carried on pickup trucks. They went all the way from Libya through the Algerian desert to Mali and caused a serious crisis. Now the French government is intervening in Mali, bombing Malians, killing people just to fight international terrorism in Mali. They already brought by themselves to Libya.
How does that make
they actually
sense?
they actually admitted that it is Libya the main source of funds, the main source of fighters that is going to Mali.
How do you explain that to someone who's not very, into geopolitics? How do you explain, because France was obviously a big backer of the Libyan rebels, that's been on the Financial Times, you can check it out. So how do you explain to someone like, wait a second, France is financing rebels in one country, and now it's bombing the same rebels which are coming out of that country in Mali. They're against them now. That is actually what you can find these facts on your own. I mean, how do you explain that? What is the sense behind that foreign policy by France?
Basically, everybody, I will talk about Libya and just spotlight Syria after that. Libya is a very rich oil country. Its reserves are one of the biggest in Africa. Its location geographically is very important because it's just against the Mediterranean to Europe. So basically, straight pipelines going through the Mediterranean or oil tankers, and that's it. You got to Europe. It's a very important place to export oil. Libya, as many sovereign governments before the toppling of the government of Gaddafi, had partners, international partners, to search for oil and gas and produce it. And I actually worked my dad worked as well in the Syrian government in the oil and gas industry, and I completely understand how the contracts are done with international partners, like for example Royal Dutch Shell, Total Fina-Elf, Eni, the Italian ExxonMobil. These names, they are the biggest oil and gas. Actually, they are not just the biggest oil and gas corporations in the world. They are the biggest corporations in the world. Anyhow, Libya again opened Libyan oil reserves to the so-called international bids. So the Libyan government hires, for example, they call it a contractor that surveys the Libyan land and search for oil and gas. They collect this data and they store it, like the Libyan government keeps it for itself, and then they offer certain blocks for investment. Different international companies come and buy this data from the Libyan government and decide, all right, this block, I think, according to my studies in these data, I would invest, for example, $20 million, and I'll go invest in that site and dig for oil. And that what happens anyway in every sovereign nation, in Syria and Egypt and Venezuela and so on. The French were not happy about the fact that the Libyan government is giving concessions for oil and gas on merit. Like for example, Shell said, I will invest $15 million in this block. But Total said, I will invest 14. The Libyan government gave it to Shell. Shell is happy, Total is not happy. Anyhow, after the toppling of the the Libyan regime, Total, the French, took basically 1/3. This is a very strange figure. You can check by yourself anyway. It's not like secret data, it's not conspiracy theory. It was on The Guardian, on the Financial Times, that Total took 1/3 of the Libyan oil of unknown reserves. So let's say they have 1 trillion barrel of oil reserves. Total Fina-Elf has 1/3 of it. If they have 3 trillion, Fina-Elf.
You mean that reserves are not being discovered yet?
Discovered yet, yes.
Under the soil.
You took what belongs. Excuse me. Let me finish this point. They took 1/3 of the oil wealth of Libya without knowing how much is in there. So if there is, again, it's unlimited. You can take as much as you can in this case because it's unknown reserves. There is no single case of such contract all around the world, from South America to China. Even in the worst corrupt countries in the world, like Nigeria, which is run directly by the Shell, chairman of board of Shell in Nigeria. They don't have these kind of contracts. They still open for international bids. And it was a joke among all serious like financial media. Like, how come Total can get such a concession? And they got it, and of course their shares in the market went sky high, and they were very happy about it. That's just a simple example of the exploitation of this war in Libya. And in Syria, it's the same. It has more with pipelines going to Europe from the Gulf, where Syria refused to pass these pipelines in favor of pipelines coming from Russia and Iran.
Obviously, well, you can say speculate about all the different theories behind why these interventions are really made. But yeah, I think we should. Yeah, I was just saying, I think it's about time we open the floor to the questions. So, please.
I'm just going to say, can we just go over the basic concepts of what the Untold story is? Because I feel we've gone in with the right information, but it's quite detailed, and I feel a lot of people here might not be as knowledgeable about this kind of stuff. So we can just go over the quick basic details about what the Untold story is. So.
Well, okay, I agree with you. Again, I said, I'll put it simple and plain. The Syrian crisis has two aspects, a humanitarian aspect and a geopolitical aspect. The media is handling the humanitarian aspect of the problem. There are bombings to the cities of Syria, which is true. If you ask me, is the Syrian army committing any atrocities against Syrians? I would say yes. This is a war. This is a serious war. There are two groups are fighting. Go ahead.
What would you say? Where have these revolutionary people come from, and who's exactly behind them? Because obviously there's all these theories about them being taught by certain countries or by certain groups and stuff.
Yes.
What in your opinion is
actually there is? I would say the majority of the fighters on the ground are Syrians from the countryside of, for example, Aleppo, around Aleppo, the countryside of Idlib, around Idlib, and so on, the countryside of Damascus, around Damascus. But the main, like the trainers, there are lots of jihadists who came from, for example, Libya, who came from Tunisia, who came. They flew the skies. I thought when you are flagged as or labeled as a terrorist, and you just left prison. For example, the case of Libya, I forgot his name, the leader of the head of the military council, who toppled, who actually took over Tripoli in the beginning of the Libyan revolution. He was a detainee in Guantanamo Bay, Belhaj. His last name is Belhaj. And during an interview on Al Jazeera, he actually said, I will ask the British government and the American government for an apology, but I forgive them because they helped us to topple Gaddafi. Now, there are lots of fighters who come in from Saudi Arabia, who are coming, and they're open about it, like the Syrian opposition, the social media are talking about the opposition, the revolution social media are talking about these heroes, as they call them.
So basically the revolution's being hijacked, but...
Exactly. I completely agree with that point.
Yeah.
The revolution was based on legitimate basis.
Yeah.
Like, there is no question that the Syrian government is corrupt, like any government in the world. It's not unique in this world by being corrupt. It's not unique by being brutal. I would say it's stupid government because it runs its political system is held by one man. He holds all the keys to the power in Syria, and he wants to keep it, and that's it. He's strong enough. For example, let's say the British political system, it has two parties, they change, but the political elite is the same. It doesn't change. As the business elite. It doesn't change. It's the same all around the world. It's up to the people to fight for changes, to fight for more concessions, to fight and so on and so forth. So it's exactly the same in Syria, but it's more in Syria. It's more owned by the government to the people, not by private corporations. It's completely different. The government controls the country completely. Anyhow, again, there are legitimate bases for this revolution. We need to move for a positive change. Even Bashar al-Assad confessed, he said, we need to go on and this political regime cannot be the same anymore, but it was hijacked by other forces. Go ahead.
You say you want a positive change. Where would you see like Syria moving after this? Say, wherever the revolution fails, Assad's government takes control again. How would you like to see Syria move, say, in 5 years' time?
There is, I would say, the Syrian government is convinced now that it cannot hold the country as it is, as it used to be. And I think if the Syrian government and the Russians are supporting this proposal, the Syrian government proposed the start of negotiations. The Syrian government has serious significant support among Syrians. In this case, they are a legitimate party in any negotiations. To eliminate this party, you are just, that's it, you are moving from one dictatorship to another dictatorship. The Syrian government admits it was a dictatorship. Let's talk now, let's start negotiating, let's rebuild the country, but till this moment, the Syrian opposition refuses any kind of negotiations with the government of Bashar al-Assad, and they're being supported by Western powers. The Russians, for example, during the Geneva Convention, it was between Burns and the Russian, it was Burns, Akhdar al-Ibrahimi, Burns from the US, I mean between the US and Russia and the UN. Yes. No, it's not the foreign secretaries. Yes, Bogdanov, the man in charge of the foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry for the Syrian crisis. William Burns, the man in charge of Syria from the U.S. Secretary Department, State Department, and Lakhdar al-Ibrahimi, the man in charge, the special envoy to Syria. They met in Geneva. They agreed on bringing all parties to negotiations. But again, after they agreed on that, the Syrian government was open for it, and the opposition refused again. And that's the main problem. Go ahead. Anyone? Go ahead.
How can the American government still support the rebellion when it is actually taken over by the supposed enemies that they're trying to fight in, say, like Iraq or Afghanistan?
All right, I was watching an interview with Simon Hirsch on CNN, and Hala Gorani, the interviewer, asked Simon Hirsch, it doesn't make any sense, how come the American government is supporting, for example, the radical Islamists in Lebanon and Syria? And he said, yes, it doesn't make any sense, they're acting irrationally. Now, they admitted that Jabhat al-Nusra, the main faction of this fighting groups, is a terrorist organization. But they still, the American government, providing, like I would say, international cover to the Syrian opposition that is providing political cover. The Syrian opposition refuses to recognize Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a terrorist, just like I would say, a faction of the Al-Qaeda. They refuse to recognize it as a terrorist organization. And that's a serious problem. When you refuse to condemn the atrocities, I would condemn any crime committed by the Syrian regime. But when the opposition refuses to condemn any single crime committed by the rebellions, we have a serious problem. And they still refuse to talk. If, again, I want to just say this. This is a very sensitive geopolitical issue. Why would the Americans do that? Why would the Israelis be happy about it? Well, they did the same anyway in the case of Afghanistan to kick the Russians out of Afghanistan. And it worked. And for them, like when one of my friends, he's an American, and he served in Afghanistan. He is an analyst, and I told him, I think the American government, he works for the government, I mean, he helps the government to run things around there. And I said, you messed it up. You sent these people, and now you have to deal with them. And he actually said this. He said, well, they can kick ass. So, yeah, I think, yeah, the radicalized people, send them to fight and then deal with the consequences. I think the US at this moment has shifted position. It changed its views. It's a bit worried about, it's a very complex issue anyway, but it's a bit worried about the big pile of chemical weapons the Syrian regime has. Now, the Syrian regime, when it feels really threatened, it will bring the world to the edge of a serious war, because it can use unconventional weapons against the enemies that are supporting this rebellion. And the US is worried about that. The second issue is the US is worried about the fall of these weapons in the hands of the wrong people, like these jihadists and so on. So the US has changed. It wanted to weaken the Syrian government, destabilize Syria, destroy the infrastructure, but that's it. I think they reached the tipping point. They're thinking now, that's it, it's enough. Let's deal with the consequences.
What other outcome could there possibly be to this civil war other than Bashar al-Assad's death?
I think this is the outcomes of this civil war, as you call it, could be anything. Could be the death of Bashar al-Assad, but I think this is very. It's just impossible. It's not going to happen because the government is quite strong. The regime will fight till the end. But what kind of outcomes can we get? We can just have a failed state. The case of Lebanon, and then in the case of Lebanon, you had different militias running different areas in Lebanon. By the end of the day, Hezbollah, the strongest militia, supported by Syria and Iran, took over the political life of Iran. When they took over the political life of Iran, and they created this strong bloc of armed groups on the borders with Israel, they caused lots of trouble to Israel. Now, the US is worried about this kind of issues. Can we get to the point of having, for example, the infiltrations of jihadists, for example, inside Israel, the biggest ally of the US in the region? I think the US is very concerned about that. At the same time, the Israelis are happy with what's happening in Syria because they were the only pain in the ass for them. Sorry, excuse my language, but this is the case. They were the only problem in the Middle East, of course the Iranians as well, but it's more directly to the Syrians. They were the main enemy in the region.
Is it true I've heard the Syrian government and the Iranian government actually the only government giving some rockets and guns to the Palestinian resistance against the Israelis?
Yes, the only governments providing the Palestinian resistance with funding and weapons are the Iranian and the Syrian government. Now, I have to say one thing. The network of jihadists in Syria are quite strong. They have some support among some radical Islamists. Why? It's a good question. How come they infiltrated the country? How come they managed to hit everywhere in every city? I blame the government for that. They failed on some security level. And I can say that the Syrian government allowed them to infiltrate Syria. Why? To access Iraq. Why? To fight the US. And they did. And the US has always complained about it. But Syria is paying the price for playing such a role. This Syrian government, the Syrian regime, again, is a sovereign, it's not a puppet regime in the Middle East to the US, and not like the Egyptian regime, Mubarak regime, or even the current regime. Not like the Saudi regime or the Qatari regime or other regimes. And the Syrian government were not happy, absolutely not happy about the presence of the American military on its border with a very aggressive behavior. And they always say in Syria, to have a tiger in your backyard is very dangerous, but to have a wounded tiger in your backyard is more dangerous. And we always thought that the American army in Iraq, struggling with this insurgency and unstable country, is a very serious issue. And they intensified support to the Iraqi jihadi movement to get the Americans out, and they managed to do it. And the Americans made the Syrian government pay the price. Now, this is, I'm talking, this is very geopolitical. You have to research and study a lot. But again, I'm trying just to spotlight a few things.
Yeah, that question.
Same question as
Okay.
What do you think this sort of the Syrian revolution has done for sort of the opinion of the Syrian people towards Western countries, America?
That's a very good question. I'd like to say this actually. A couple of days ago, I had a visitor, a friend came, the same guy, American friend, who worked with the American government in Afghanistan, and he was going to come here, but he had to travel. Anyhow, I told him the same. The American and the Western government failed to at least gain minimum support among the Syrians who matter, those who understand what's happening in the world. Let's say lots of Syrians, educated young people, were very uncertain about their views. Some of them are pro-Iran, some of them are pro-Russia, few of them are pro the West. Now, they're all shifted their views when they felt their country is threatened by the West, when they saw by their own eyes how the West is supporting jihadists, destroying their infrastructure, killing them, destroying universities, bombing everywhere, anything. One of my friends, for example, he was studying in the US. He felt very angry to the point that he dropped his school and went to Brazil to teach English. That's just a simple example. Syrians in general are very suspicious, very well informed already, but they're very open to the world and very suspicious of the American role in the Middle East. Because it's obvious, I mean, the American role in Iraq, the American role in, for example, for the Palestinians, the American role in Afghanistan, and so on. But now they have experienced that by themselves, and I think the West lost. And I find sometimes some spokesmen, some State Department spokesmen, or the Foreign Affairs Minister in the United Kingdom, Mr. Haig, when they talk and they really think maybe they trust the mainstream media that they brainwash these people, or these Syrians, or these like British people. But I just like, if you're Syrian and you spoke English, and when you listen to William Hague, when he's talking about supporting and helping the Syrians, well, let's go help them now. There are lots of Syrians, refugees, in camps, in tents, in Jordan, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and nobody is helping them at all. If you're talking about helping the Syrians, try to help them in countries you can access. Try to help them through your friends, your Turkish friends, your Jordanian allies, your Lebanese friends. Why not helping these Syrians? Why just you want to help the Syrians by bombing the country? Just stop talking about this. Let's go help these people. I actually want to add this point. One of my friends in the US tried to send blankets, wool blankets, to Syrians who lost their homes inside Syria, because those who lost their homes outside Syria are the responsibility of the United Nations now. And the shipment was denied access to Syria, and it was by the US Customs Department, and I can post you this policy, and then it says containing sanctioned material, and it was wool. So for the US, sending arms is alright. That's no problem. If we planted a gun inside these blankets, it would have got to Syria. We would have managed to reach these people who had no blankets. But if to send a blanket to warm up people, that's a serious problem. A national security issue.
Is that because of the sanctions then?
It's a sanction problem. Syria is sanctioned by the US. When I worked in the oil and gas industry in Syria, every equipment that had 1-2% American technology, it was denied access to Syria. And we struggled a lot to, because most of the advanced equipment are made in the US. We struggled with our power generators and other equipment, infrastructure stuff.
So you mentioned the refugees, and when we hear the figures of these refugees on the media, it's like, oh, 60,000 refugees scattered around the Middle East, and people think that's like it's all the government's fault. But if you can explain to them how are these refugees actually becoming refugees? Because basically, I know the government bombs part of cities which are taken by rebels first. So they're not bombing houses with civilians inside. They're bombing empty houses, and the tenants of these houses were.
I'll tell you, this is Now we cannot deny the fact that there must be some cases of Syrian army bombing a civilian house, killing civilians. There is no way you can avoid that in this case of war. We gave them this argument to the opposition, like, how about you just avoid entering cities, like the city of Aleppo. You destroyed one of the ancientest cities in the world, like the city of Damascus, like the city of Idlib, like the city of Homs. Why don't you just attack the army, the regime army as you call it, from where it's based, or in its camps in the desert? No, they want to enter the cities. They enter the cities. They ravage the cities. The amount of crime, robbery, rape, public executions, beheading of people, stoning. It's against a kind of rule in the regions they took over, and many people ran away from them. Some of them ran inside Syria, inside the major cities held strongly by the government, and some of them because of geographically they were connected easily to Lebanon or Jordan, like the case of Daraa, like the case of Damascus suburbs, Damascus countryside. They have access to Lebanon. The case of Daraa to Jordan, the case of northern Syria, Aleppo countryside, and Idlib to Turkey, and other cities like Deir ez-Zor to Iraq. Now, all of these refugees live in tents. They have to buy, like the case of Al-Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, and the media. I find that strange. Is the Syrian regime running the Jordanian government? Is he bombing the Jordanian land? Is he bombing the refugee camps in Turkey? How about Iraq and Lebanon? No, he's not. And these governments, which are very close allies to the West, they have access to their banks and methods of funding, and none of them provided minimum help to these refugees. Of course, some of them got some access to help, but the majority of the refugees are struggling from lack of minimum services. Some of them still till now they don't have tents, and so on and so forth. This is a very it gets to me really bad, because when the war took place in Iraq, when the US invaded Iraq, even before the war, when they sanctioned Iraq, and Iraq was sanctioned by the international community, by the UN. There is a difference between a UN sanctions program and a bilateral sanction program. For example, Syria is sanctioned only by the US and UN and EU, but Iraq was sanctioned by the whole world. In this case, the Iraqis had no access to any market. They had no access to any country to trade. The only country that opened its borders to Iraqis to come and live and trade and be active was Syria. When the war took place in Iraq, there was no single tent in Syria. Every Iraqi had the right to buy or rent a place in Syria. They had the right to work, they had the right for education, and had free health care. Of course, free education as well. It's the same case with the Palestinian refugees and so on. But when the Syrians became refugees in Jordan and in Iraq and Lebanon and Turkey, they lived in tents. And till now, the international community fails to help these refugees, and they talk about helping them inside Syria by bombing them. And I don't think they will do it. I think it's just a way of provoking the situation, inflaming the situation, giving the rebels hope that we will bomb the country. But as a matter of fact, Syria is quite strong with its air defense systems provided by Russia, and the US is very keen about not going in there. They're not interested. They cannot afford to lose many airplanes and many pilots and so on and so forth. None of these powers are willing to. Even the French couldn't take Gaddafi, which was a very weak country. I mean Libya. They needed help from the British, and they couldn't do it. And actually, they needed help from the Americans, and they managed to do it. So I don't think they will do it, but I just hope that they start thinking rationally, and if they want to help somebody, let them help the refugees in the refugee camps in the countries around Syria. Go ahead.
Surely on the international level, it should be legal for Western countries, whichever country, to supply rebels with arms. So what is the United Nations doing about that? Should they have a...
There is actually, according to international law, there is no arms ban on Syria. And most of these deals, most of these weapons that are coming to the Syrian rebels are coming, for example, a Saudi company, the Saudi military buys weapons from Ukraine, from the US, from any manufacturer around Europe, and they just ship it to Saudi Arabia and then to Turkey. And most of the access of the weapons comes from Turkey. Actually, the British media talked about it. Lots of British journalists talked about shipments of weapons coming from Turkey. They were based in Turkey, they witnessed that, they saw the weapons coming through and so on and so forth. They saw by themselves ex-military men, American ex-military men and British and French training Syrian rebels on the borders with Turkey. There is no arms ban on Syria, but it's illegal to supply like terrorist groups, any armed groups with weapons, but they still do it through their proxies. And their proxies don't care about international law anyway.
So doesn't that give the Syria a right to declare war on those countries?
Actually, yes.
The stability of the country.
Yeah, I agree. When some hawkish kind of regime top officials were serious about starting a war with Turkey because it's the main problem, because it's the biggest border and so on. But I think of course they have the right, but again, the Syrian crisis is a very complex crisis. The geopolitics aspect in it is dominant. There is absolutely nobody cares about the humanitarian aspects. It's obvious. If they cared about it, they would have stopped the supply of weapons a long time ago. They would have helped the refugees in the refugee camps around Syria. But they refuse to do so because the geopolitical aspect is extremely important. And again, if you follow serious media, serious newspapers, you would see how important to the Syrian crisis, the Syrian situation in the financial markets, and who is going to be benefited by the collapse of the Syrian regime, and who's going to win for the Syrian regime to maintain power. But I think again, the Syrians bombed down one of Turkey's fighter jets that violated the Syrian sky, and the pilot was killed. Turkey ran away, actually screamed their heads off. They went to the NATO because they're a NATO country. They asked the NATO to activate Article 7 of the NATO treaty, which allows NATO to defend one of their countries. But they refuse to do so. Again, there is the Russian factor, the Chinese factor, the Syrian air defense factor. There is the danger of bringing the whole region into chaos, which is difficult to handle by major powers. So they were silenced, the terrorists. The Erdogan government, I mean, they were silenced and they were told to just do what they're told. The Syrian government is the same. They don't want to go insane and just invade countries, and that would maybe bring the world to a serious crisis between the Russians and the Americans and might have serious implications. So they'd rather just contain the crisis. The Syrian government is, I want to praise, which is a bit strange, I want to praise the Syrian government because it's doing its best to contain a very serious crisis within Syria and not expel it around, because it might destabilize the whole region and eventually the whole world, and might bring the world to a serious world war. And that's why it's a very rare case for a double veto from China and Russia in one session, and in another following session as well. A double veto by two major powers. It didn't ever happen. Never happened. Because it's a serious problem, geopolitically.
Okay. Why didn't Bashar al-Assad just resign or have an election when this whole thing started?
I think Bashar al-Assad is kind of, he doesn't want to look, again, he's strong, this government is strong, and its understanding of power. Now it cannot provide proper life to the Syrians, but it cannot fall as well. And he is playing a major important role in his view, I think, in world history. He doesn't want to run like a coward. He want to fight. He want to keep, because it doesn't make any difference if he resigns or not. This is simplifying the issue. Bashar al-Assad is not the issue. The issue is the position of Syria in the Middle Eastern map. Is it going to be biased towards the US? Is it biased towards the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa? Is it going to be sovereign? That's what matters. Bashar al-Assad himself doesn't matter. If he dies, if he gets killed, if he resigns, it doesn't matter. It's about Syria as a secular, sovereign nation.
I mean, you talk about the defiance of Bashar al-Assad, but if you look at Saddam Hussein, he was defiant. If you look at Gaddafi, he was defiant. So surely history tells us Bashar al-Assad might see the same fate as the East.
Okay, that's a possibility again. I'm saying it's possible. If the US is willing to go to war, if the US is willing to go to a war into Syria, I would say he could end up like Saddam or Gaddafi. He could. It's a possibility. They could be defeated as well, because again.
So this power struggle, they don't care about their lives, is it?
No, he doesn't. Of course, he doesn't. He doesn't care. Absolutely, he doesn't care about his life, his present life. He is a young man. He loves life. I never liked him, to be honest. I was never a supporter of Bashar al-Assad. But now I think he is a proper leader because he did not run the country off and just leave the Syrians to deal with their problems alone. He is defending the country. There is a massive support to Bashar al-Assad, and there is massive support to the Syrian government, and he leads the Syrian government now. He holds all the keys, the political keys in Syria. He's the strongest man in Syria, and that's how power's run. Now, I don't know, okay, if he resigns, maybe it's a lot better for everybody. Just resign and just have peace. It doesn't work like that. Let's say if Saddam Hussein resigned his office and fled the country with his two sons, as George Bush asked him to do you think the US would have just avoided invading Iraq? Do you think the US would go to Iraq just to kill Saddam Hussein, to bring in democracy? If you think that the issue in Syria is about Bashar al-Assad, in this case, you missed not just the humanitarian aspect and the geopolitical aspect. You missed the whole point. of this crisis in the Middle East.
Now, I'm not talking about Bashar al-Assad himself. No, what I'm trying to say is that maybe things could work out better if he was on the negotiating team. Saying that
he is offering negotiation. That's the problem. He is offering negotiation with the Syrian opposition. The Syrian opposition, some of them joined his government anyway now already. They are in the government, in the Syrian government. The communists, the nationalists, and some liberals. But the opposition that is based outside of Syria, like in Qatar, Turkey, France, the US, they refuse to talk to Bashar al-Assad. Or his government, they call it, the Ba'ath regime or government. And since he is the strongest man in Syria, he is the man in charge, he is the one to talk to. If there is any, this is history now, how he came to power, through his father, how his father maintained stability in Syria for 30 years. After a series of military coups in Syria, he is the last one who maintained power in Syria. Why? There is a very good book, I read it in Arabic, written by Patrick Seal. I think the exact translation in Arabic would be The Struggle Over Syria. If you find this book, you will understand why Syria is in this position and why Bashar al-Assad is still in power. It's a very important book. Go ahead.
Well, before this, I was doing some reading on Bashar al-Assad's political ideology, and I was wondering to what extent is the idea of pan-Arab nationalism dead in the Arab world?
I would say it's dead. But Bashar al-Assad is looked at as the last Arab national in the region, among nationalists from Egypt to Iraq. Just to let me tell you this: Bashar al-Assad is married to a British lady. He came here to study. He's married to a British Syrian origin, from Syrian origin, but she's British. He speaks English. He loves life. He's more liberal. He's not with serious political ideology. He opened the country. He liberalized the economy. And I blame him for that. I blame the crisis, the struggle of the poor in Syria on Bashar al-Assad's economic policies. Syria was not ready to liberalize the economy. And but when you say ideology, no. Syria is about its role in the Middle East. It doesn't follow any serious ideology. For example, they supported Islamists in Iraq, in Lebanon, nationalists in Egypt, for example, nationalists in Syria, nationalists in Turkey, and so on. Syria, for example, supported the Kurdish movement in Turkey, inside Turkey, politically at least. We don't know about any other uncovered agenda, but at least they supported Turkish nationalism in Turkey. Kurdish nationalism in Turkey. And so they do not follow, like, as you said, as you described, in ideological, political views. No, not at all. It's very open. And again, mainstream media try to portray him as the young Saddam Hussein or young Hafiz Assad, his father.
Or even Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, that's kind of. Go ahead.
Would you not say that all these countries within the Middle East and going on to South Asia, parts of South Asia anyway, would you not agree that these countries have brought it on themselves because of the governments that are in place? Because these governments haven't allowed certain freedoms for their people, other countries have got the ability to cause these problems, cause these apparent revolutions. So would you not say it's the fault of...
Of course, it's the first one to be blamed in this crisis is the Syrian government and its political elite and its intellectual elite and its religious elite. Those are the ones to be blamed for what happened to Syria. But I cannot ignore as well the external factors as well. The intervention, the interference from Turkey, from Qatar, the money, the funding, the Saudi interference, the American support, the Western support in general. I blame my government first to be, at least to be, not to be hypocritical, I have to blame the Syrian government, but as well I blame Western government for doing so. But again, I wouldn't blame them because that's control, hegemony policies were followed all around the world. South America, when did they support democracy? I mean, they want to support democracy in Yugoslavia, but they did not support it in Chile. Or in Venezuela, they tried to topple the elected president through a military coup. So I'm not convinced they're trying to topple Bashar al-Assad, who is not democratic for democratic reason. They're trying to change the geopolitical face of the region. That's at least I'm convinced of. I cannot say, all right, I'll follow the American narrative because I'm in favor of democracy. All right, I am in favor of democracy, but I'm not in favor of bombing my country. I'm not in favor of sectarian war inside my country, killing people just because they belong to different religions and sects. It doesn't make any sense. And I would ask this question to you: if what would the British government do if they had the Free British Army inside their lands, fighting for example, religious rights for certain religious minorities? Would they allow them to get the weapons from, for example, if they got their weapons from France, what do you expect from the British to do? Just sit and watch and let these people take over cities and impose their certain laws and go on with it, go from city to another? Or do you think the
Cameron should resign and leave the country?
do you think Cameron? It's a serious. Let's ask the U.S. government. What would they do if they had, and they had such a case before? What did they do about it? They massacred them. That's what any government would do. A government is a center of power. And a center of power has to maintain. For example, I pay tax for the Syrian government if I was in Syria, for example, because they provide me services, facilities, security. If they don't do that, I have to pay someone else to do that for me. Now, it's their job, it's their duty to fight and maintain stability in the country. And I'm not convinced there is no single armed struggle that led to a democratic government. You cannot name one single case in the history of the world, in the modern history of the world, where an armed struggle supported by different powers led to a democratic government. In this case, I am convinced it's just basic common sense and logic. In this case, the struggle over Syria is not about bringing democracy. So I would stand against this struggle and I would support stability. That's my very mild view of the situation. And I cannot, but my parents live in Syria. My brother just left the country, but my parents still live in Syria. I want them safe. I don't want them to be ruled by gangsters. I'd rather see an undemocratic government with certain civil laws, maintaining peace, security for people, and not gangsters, killing, stealing, raping, executing people on the street. No, I'd rather see my government in my army. That makes sense. The other side does not make any sense at all.
Patrick? Who thinks the game? I know, assuming Assad gets deposed and killed, do you think like the Western bloc, like America and Israel, or Russia and China will win most from the destabilization of this region?
Say again, please.
Do you think like either the West or the East, as in like Russia and China, like assuming it's like two big blocs, will gain most from this region being stabilized?
The issue is not about Bashar al-Assad. The pillars of his regime were already killed. If he dies or not, it doesn't make any difference. It would make some kind of a difference. Maybe it's more psychological, but his death would not change the situation on the ground. The Syrian government is a functioning government. It's a constitutional, it's undemocratic, but still constitutional, it's functioning, it has army, it has institutions, and if he dies, there will be someone to replace him. So the work, two blocs are working with no consideration of Bashar al-Assad's life. They're trying to negotiating a better deal for everybody, for themselves. But they're trying to negotiate a better deal over Syria with no consideration to Bashar al-Assad. But they also know, Bashar al-Assad's allies, that he's the strongest in Syria in power, and he will maintain power, and they count on that.
Yeah.
Now, if he dies, and someone else comes to power, still represents the Syrian government views, he will be the new ally of China and Russia. It won't make any difference, that's what I'm trying to say.
Will Syria ever be a democracy?
I don't know, that's
what I want.
It could be, I hope so, but it's, for the time being, I don't think even 20 years would be enough. After the complete destruction of infrastructure and institutions.
Right. You spoke of the various religious groups within Syria. Do you think, sort of with the displacements, the refugees, the whole trouble that's going on, do you think that's going to really increase tensions between the different sects?
It already
and do you
did.
think that will have a long-lasting effect?
It already did. One of my friends who lives in Lebanon now, he is Armenian Christian Orthodox, because Syria has lots of a big Armenian community. When he got into the taxi going from Beirut to Damascus, he was a bit worried, and the driver told him, "Don't worry about it. Nowadays they're just picking the Alawites, not the Christians. Sometimes they're just not picking the Christians and not the Alawites." But he just told me, he made me feel a bit comfortable. Just the Alawites. That's very comforting. Of course, it's a hideous war, and everybody killing. Mainly the rebellion side, from the rebellion side, they're killing on sectarian basis, deporting, for example, deporting Christians from their homes and the villages they access, just because they're Christians. Then they call them infidels and so on and so forth. And some of them were killed, some of them were escaped, but it's a bad war, and the responsibility of the West is on this kind of issues. Like if you support a fighting group that that kills people on purpose just because on sectarian basis or religious basis, and you still support it, you still provide them with political cover and funding. That's a crime.
That is not how you implement democracy in a country. It's not by
Absolutely
supporting
not.
these kind of groups.
No, of course not. Of course not.
Anyway, that's we've got to, what's the time? 7? That's it.
3 minutes to.
Well, yeah. Whatever.
So to get this straight, Bashar al-Assad is not the problem. Even if he dies, there'll still be a dictatorship. The Free Syrian Army isn't going to make this country a democracy. It's going to be 20 years until it is a democracy.
Well, I never say that. I'm just trying to say the other side of the opposition side and their fighting men are not even thinking about democracy. I'm not talking about those who are now in Europe or promoting themselves as democratic and so on. They don't matter, because it matters. Those who matter are the people on the ground with guns. Those who are outside of Syria, who has no power on these armed groups, who are already unorganized and they have no proper leadership. You cannot tell me that these people in Europe who are secular, are democratic, can control these fighting groups in Syria. When Bashar al-Assad controls his army, and he's responsible for everything the army does. And in this case, I don't see the other side winning, because there is no other side. There is other sides, I would say. There are different groups, different leadership, different views. Those who are talking politics in Europe have no control on the ground at all.
If you're a fan of anarchy, maybe that's the side you want to support.
Maybe.
Anyway, thank you for coming along.
Thank
It's
you.
been a
Thank you very
nice debate.